impossible to come to the Hillman Awards and not leave inspired. And tonight, that video reminds us of the great history of the Hillmans, in which tonight's recipients are a part of. I am honored to introduce the Book Award for the Hillman. In 1974, 20 years after Brown versus Board of Ed, the Supreme Court issued another momentous decision in the case of Milliken versus Bradley. The justices brought a halt to school desegregation across the North and to the civil rights movement struggle for a truly equal education for all. In the Containment, Detroit, the Supreme Court, and the battle for racial justice in the North, legal scholar Michelle Adams, who was born and grew up in Detroit, tells the story of the struggle to integrate Detroit schools and what happened when it collided with Nixon-appointed justices committed to a judicial counter-revolution. Adams chronicles the devoted activists who tried to lift up Detroit students amid the upheavals of riots, Black Power, and white flight, and how their efforts led to federal Judge Stephen Roth's landmark order to achieve racial balance by tearing down the walls, separating the city and its suburbs. This, quote, metropolitan remedy could have remade the landscape of racial justice, but instead, the Supreme Court, ruled that the suburbs could not be a part of the effort to integrate, and thus upheld the savage inequalities that remain in place today. Adams chronicles this story with a compelling blend of academic rigor, repertorial legwork, and engaging prose. She depicts portraits of a city under stress and of key figures, including Detroit's first Black mayor, Coleman Young, Justices Marshall, Rehnquist, and Powell. Adams' book reminds us, in its exploration of class as well as race, of Anthony Lucas's 1985 masterpiece. I had thought it was a previous recipient of a Hillman, but it was not. The Containment is a legal and historical drama that exposes the roots of today's backlash against diversity, equity, voting rights, and other efforts to fulfill this country's promise. I want to welcome Michelle Adams, who will be signing books afterwards at the reception. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm deeply honored to receive the Hillman Prize for Book Journalism and grateful to the Sidney Hillman Foundation for this recognition. I want to tell you a story about democracy. When I was writing The Containment, I went back to Detroit, my hometown, and to the case that became Milliken versus Bradley. The story begins with a group of Black parents and the Detroit branch of the NAACP. One of them was Verda Bradley, who simply wanted her children to have access to equal educational opportunity in a system that had deliberately denied it. They brought a lawsuit challenging segregation in the public schools, insisting that what many people treated as accident or preference was, in fact, the result of government action. In doing so, they forced a conversation that the city and the country had not been willing to have. They put facts on the table. They made claims on the Constitution. They insisted on being heard. And they were joined, sometimes quietly, sometimes at real cost, by white suburban residents who were willing to imagine a more integrated metropolitan future. And then that conversation moved to a federal courtroom, where it reached a judge named Stephen Roth. Roth did not begin as a hero of civil rights. In fact, he was deeply skeptical of the plaintiff's claims, skeptical that segregation in Detroit was anything more than the result of private choices. But then something happened. Over the course of a long trial, Roth listened. He heard evidence about how segregation in the North had been created and maintained through law, through policy, through state action. And he changed his mind. That transformation is the part of the story that I keep coming back to. Black Detroiters started a democratic conversation, and the court at its best was capable of hearing it. Not democracy as voting, not democracy as slogans, but democracy as a process of reason-giving, of listening, of confronting facts, of being willing to revise your views in public. And that kind of democracy is hard. It asks something of us. It asks whether we're still willing to listen to people to whom we disagree with, whether we're still willing to be bound by a shared factual record, whether we're still willing to take each other seriously as participants in a common project, the American project. The story I tell in this book is in part about what happens when those democratic practices break down, when lines get drawn between city and suburb, between us and them, and those lines harden into structures that shape opportunity for generations. But it's also a story about people who believed that democracy was still worth the effort, that the long, difficult argument of democracy, messy, contested, incomplete, was still the way forward. So if there's one thing I hope that people take away from my book, it's this: democracy is not self-executing. It depends on whether we're willing to do the work, to listen, to reason, and sometimes to change our minds. And if we are, then the long argument of democracy, the one that began, does not end with us. It continues through us. Thank you very much.